Hello and welcome to your curriculum development series, a series of videos to help you to tweak, enhance, review and create the best curriculum that you can for your subject. My name's Lisa Ashes and I've been working with curriculums since at least 2012 when I developed the Manglish curriculum, which was about connecting the curriculum through maths and English at the heart. Since then, I've worked internationally, nationally, across phases in education and in the public and private sector to support schools in developing, tweaking, reviewing, rewriting or revolutionising curriculums. So I've got an idea of many curriculums and what the possibilities are, and I just want to share some of that knowledge with you and help you to review and reflect on your own curriculum. Welcome to video 3 of our curriculum development series. Hopefully you've had the chance to really review your curriculum and explore the knowledge within your curriculum and the opportunities there are to make it even better. In this video, we're looking at sequencing and connections so that we can really assess where our students are, we can support those that need it, and we can challenge those that are ready for it. As you're watching this video, feel free to pause at any time if conversations are sparked, because that's the idea of these videos, to really get your ideas flowing, to provide you with examples, but for you to ask, how might that work for us? And how might we make our curriculum even better than it already is? Looking at connections, sequencing, assessment for support and challenge, we are exploring where we think we are and trying to diagnose this as accurately as possible so we can think about what next steps need to be taken when we are building our curriculum. Curriculums can be adapted all of the time. They don't need to be thrown out and never used again, but they do need to be reflected upon regularly. Even if your curriculum is amazing, there's always new things that we can try to make it even better. For part 1, think about your sequencing. How clear are your learning goals? Do you know what learning goals come before and after? Do we know where they are leading? Are we really clear on the sequence of our curriculum? For this session, make sure that you have copies of any curriculum planning documents so that you can review them. You can pause the recording at any time if you think of something that you want to discuss to do with your specific curriculum. You'll also need access to the primary national curriculum for your subject if you want to consider the starting points of your subject. Let's begin by looking at an example overview. Now, consider the points on this overview in terms of your own. Is there anything that you think you might add? Is there anything about the sequencing that you think might be important to stop and discuss? So I'll explain the overview in each of the parts. First of all, there's a really clear focus for the subject and what we expect students to achieve in each of the units. We've really simplified the expectations into reading, writing, speaking, and listening. And the reason for that is we think about the really clear outcomes for students. The outcomes are simplified into reading, writing, speaking, and listening for different purposes. We've also identified an ARE to do with that specific outcome. And we've thought really carefully about what students can achieve in each year group by looking back at the primary national curriculum, exploring what they have not learned yet and using that as a starting point. So really knowing what students are expected to know, we then developed age-related expectation that we think that students can meet by the end of each of these units. So for example, in Unit 2, students will write a linear analysis. This is something that is not taught in Key Stage 2, so it's new information for the students, but we do know that students understand how to read a text, how to question a text at Key Stage 2, so writing a linear analysis is a good next step for them. By the end of Year 7, students are all expected to be able to know how to plan and write a linear analysis. So each time we come back to a reading unit, students get the opportunity to write a linear analysis to perfect that. This really helps us when we are planning our assessments, because we are looking at how students have improved on a specific area of English. Similarly, in the writing examples, each time students are assessed on this specific area. So our assessments are built in here and again here. So there are two summative assessment points where it is a real exam experience for the students. The important thing is that they have been taught the right information before the assessment. Students are assessed all of the time, assessment for learning in the classroom. However, these are the points where we can collect in the data. There are only 2 across the year, and students have the opportunity to build the skills as we really thought carefully about the outcome that we need students to achieve. One thing that ties the whole curriculum together across 7, 8, and 9 is a literary timeline. Now, the reason that we chose to put the literary timeline in as the ingredient that students review and come back to time and time again is because we noticed that when students got to Key Stage 5, where they really needed to know about the timeline, it was something that teachers had to teach for the first time. This is an opportunity missed because students are learning about texts from the timeline all of the time. So think about what might tie your curriculum together. And you'll see how this ties together when we look at the information in 8 and in 9. Each unit, we decided to have a key theme. Now, these themes are linked to the GCSE, but we don't specifically use the GCSE themes. So students need to know and to be able to analyse key themes, and we've chosen to build these themes each year. So each year they'll review that theme, but you'll see it gets more complex as time goes on. And then we've got suggested texts. And these suggested texts were picked for their richness, for what the students can get out of them, for their links to the theme. But we really want students to get a good experience of literature across time and extracts from various sources. So we just try to make this as rich as possible. So we've got a really clear focus for English. We've got an age-related expectation, which we thought very carefully about what they have not been taught in primary school, so that it is new information, it's challenging information, but it's something that they need to be able to do when they sit their GCSEs. So they're perfecting exactly what it is they need to do, but they're doing it in an age-appropriate way. We've tied the whole curriculum together by using a literary timeline. We have got key themes across each of the units, and we've suggested texts that are really rich. We've also built in time here so that students can have a different kind of experience. We chose to focus in on careers as our opportunity to do something different with English. So we could show them that English is not just for an exam, English is a skill that we use in life. So consider, when reflecting on your curriculum, consider if you've got a really clear focus for each of your units, why those focuses have been chosen. Think about the age-related expectation or the outcomes that you want for students. Have they been mapped against the primary curriculum? Have they been chosen specifically so that students can build skills towards GCSE or towards A-level? How's your curriculum tied together? So each year when students come back to things, how are they able to link their new learning to old? Do you use themes? And if you do, why? Is this something that can support them in developing their knowledge towards GCSE and retaining knowledge? And also consider the text that you've got chosen, the reading materials that students use, the sources of information. Are these varied? Why have they been chosen? Now, for each of the units, we also have essential knowledge, we thought about the knowledge that we want students to retain in years to come. So the knowledge that students are being taught in year 7, we've identified what's the most important knowledge that students will need to retain in future years. And that's the knowledge that we will use for recall. That's the knowledge that will be returned to time and time again. We've split this into substantive, so the facts that they need to know and they need to remember, and also disciplinary, the ways in which they need to learn how to work to become a literary critic or a writer in terms of our subject, but to be able to look at things in a particular way in our subject. So we split it into these two forms of knowledge in order to really be clear on what we want them to learn. We also ask the questions, why this? Why here? Why are we doing this exact thing? Why are we learning this? Why do they need to know this knowledge? And why do they need to know it here? What's the important part about it? So when you're looking through your curriculum, consider how you identify the knowledge that they need to know. Are you all really clear on what it is that they will remember in years to come, and how you've planned to make sure that they remember that information, perhaps through retrieval or revisiting information? Now, we've thought about how knowledge builds, and again, we said that this is linked together through the timeline. So every year, the students will cover the same period of the timeline in the same order. And that way we are recalling information about that timeline. We're also adding new information about that timeline. This helps the students to know that a piece of literature sits within a certain period in time. Obviously, every year they revisit the timeline, they add to their knowledge of this. And so this is something that they will remember. The themes, although they change, the themes are closely linked to the theme that was presented previously, but it increases in complexity. So in year 7, for example, students are looking at magic. When they move to year 8, it becomes the supernatural. In year 7, they're looking at innocence and maturity. In year 8, they then look at responsibility. And then when they move to year 9, you'll see the timeline is exactly the same. So they are recognizing by this point that the text that they are looking at sits somewhere within the timeline of literary history. But then their theme becomes perception and reality and leadership. So the theme becomes age appropriate in how we look at these texts. The texts also increase in complexity, but every year the texts are different. The only thing that links that together is where they sit within the timeline. That gives the students the opportunity to compare and contrast texts from similar places in the timeline. So everything that's done on this curriculum is done with purpose, whether it is the focus of what they're looking at. So we go from reading to writing to reading to writing to reading to writing, always allowing the students to build up their knowledge, to reflect and review. Each time we do a piece of writing, we can look back on the previous piece because the outcome that we're trying to achieve, the age-related expectation, is the same. And that allows us to really assess and move students forward. Whether it's the ARE, really thinking about what we expect students to achieve and at different levels. So when they first come to us, when they're about to sit their GCSEs, we know exactly where that ARE is leading. We know how things are linked together. We know why themes have been put in there. We know why we're using the text we're doing. We know why we're doing an assessment at the time we are doing it. Everything has been questioned for why this, why here. Now, in order to develop the curriculum, We looked at the primary endpoints and we looked at the curriculum endpoints for us as teachers. And we tried to map the schemas that might be being created. We went back as far as early years to look at specific topics that we teach. However, looking at the year 6 curriculum for your subject is a really good starting point. You don't have to go all the way back to EYFS. But for us, for example, we were looking at how students developed a schema for example, structure, for understanding how texts are structured. So we looked all the way back to EYFS and thought about the development of that schema. We also looked at the endpoint for us, and we looked at our exam expectations. And we considered what it was that students needed to be able to do in a disciplinary way and needed to know in the substantive knowledge in order to be successful at our endpoints. So we looked at where they were and what they've been through in their development of this knowledge, where we need them to go, and we considered the common mistakes that students make at those endpoints that we wish, if they didn't make those mistakes, that we would find our teaching so much easier. And using that knowledge, that helped us to think really carefully about the direction the students were taking. That helped us to split our knowledge into reading, writing, speaking, and listening. It helped us to develop the correct AREs, or what we expected students to achieve by the end of each of the units with us. It helped us to really think about what was possible. Like I said, we went all the way back to EYFS, but you don't need to. Consider what they should already know. Now, should is in bold because we know that not all students come to us with the perfect knowledge, just like when they get to GCSE, they don't have the perfect knowledge. But what should they know? How might we assess that when they come in so that we're really clear on what they do know, so we're starting at the right place? Now, I want you to use this information to consider your own curriculum. So I want you to pause the recording and start with these questions to consider how you are developing your big picture of learning. Are you able to map the schema of your big picture, starting with a desired end point and thinking about the start point that the students should be at when they come with you? Can you use the map to identify the most important learning goals for your students? So there are so many things that we want students to know and to learn, but what are the most important skills or disciplinary ways of working or knowledge that students must know? Can you use the map to reinforce the most important learning goals systematically? So we could split our work into reading, writing, speaking, listening, and we were able to repeat those in different ways so that students the skills were reinforced systematically. Can you do that with your curriculum? Can you use the map to identify the points where knowing what they know will be most useful to you so that you get your assessment points right? Can you ensure that assessments identify the component parts of learning? They're not just endpoints, but they really give you the information you need for the next unit of work to be more successful for the students. Pause the recording and use these questions as a starting point to think about the bigger picture of your subject. Before we move on to look at assessment in more detail, here are some more questions to help you to review your curriculum sequencing. Are students taught systematically the knowledge skills required to lead them towards curriculum endpoints? Does planning sequence new knowledge to build on previous understanding towards new learning? Are crucial components identified and emphasised to ensure they're remembered over the long term? How does your starting point build on what students already know. Now that you've had the opportunity to reflect and discuss about the sequencing within your curriculum, so based on those previous activities, where would you rate your curriculum sequencing? It doesn't matter where you've rated your curriculum sequencing. It matters that we are using that rating to plan the best next steps to make it even better. So you might want to carefully review the start and end points for your students, and working together as a department, build that really clear path of progression. You might want to review the strength of your progression steps. Where are the opportunities to build knowledge better? You might want to consider the specifics of your substantive, disciplinary, procedural, hinterland progression. Where can improvements be made to improve the student outcomes so that the knowledge is better sequenced, students can revisit information, but in a really systematic way so that they're building their knowledge? Or you might want to just build even better learners through the sequencing of knowledge and skills. So you might consider what else you can do in order to make this happen. Let's move on to look at assessment in more detail. Again, we are looking to rate how we assess our students, and we're looking to see realistically where we are and how we can make improvements so that assessment is really being used for purpose to improve students' learning experiences. Use this section to rate your current assessment practice. As you're looking at your assessment practice, look to see how you can make tweaks to make it even better. In the previous video, we looked at riddles, and I've presented here a new riddle just as an example, rather than presenting you with the old one, which you'll know the answer to now because you've already experienced it. Now you know what I'm about to do with this riddle because we've experienced this in the previous video. We are thinking about when we create schemes of learning, we're thinking about creating desirable difficulties for our students. It needs to be not too difficult, not too easy. It needs to be something that is a desirable difficulty for them at the right level at the right time. In the previous video, we looked at a riddle and you explored how you can visualize all of the parts of that riddle. So we had the candle, the matches, and the box of pins, and you can use that information to wrestle with the right answer, to question, to gather ideas, to try out ideas. And so it was representative of a desirable difficulty. If you want to try that again, I've presented a new riddle here for you. There's a light bulb inside a closet. The door's closed. You can't see if the light is on or off. You know the light is off to start with. Outside the closet, there are 3 switches. One of the light switches controls the light bulb in the closet. You can flip the switches on or off, but once you open the door, you can no longer touch the switches. Now, if you are rubbish at riddles, you've probably switched off and waited for the right answer. However, you can visualize all of these things, and so you're able to wrestle with the information. We want students to be able to wrestle with the information within our curriculums. We don't want it to be too easy. What is the capital in France? And I've underlined it. And we don't want it to be too difficult. What we want is to develop our curriculum in such a way that students have the right information. It feels like a desirable difficulty. It's not too difficult, and it's not too easy for them to engage with. We want a curriculum that really excites students, but allows them to get better. It doesn't stop them in their tracks and make them feel like they're no good at this subject. And it also doesn't bore them because they feel like they've already done that before. And to get to that sweet spot, we need to be assessing students really effectively. Now, these three types of assessment we can consider when looking again at our curriculum. Assessment of learning, which is used to demonstrate the achievement. These are our summative assessments, our final assessments. Assessment for learning, which is using evidence of achievement to adapt what happens in the classroom to meet learners' needs. And assessment as learning, empowering our students to manage their own learning. The aim with assessment as learning is to involve the student in the process of their own performance. When we considered these three types of learning for our previous example that we looked at, we found that the question level analysis reports that were generated from our assessments showed us the missing knowledge. And because we looked at reading, writing, there was always the opportunity for students to improve, to get better based on what we found out. So we were really careful with the kind of questions we were asking in exams. Although this is assessment of learning, it always has the opportunity to be assessment for learning. If it's the final exam in the year, it still feeds into their next steps. And it also feeds into our next steps as teachers, because we can see the common mistakes that students have made. So any examination, any assessment is used for purpose, whether it's to feed forward to the students or whether it is to feed into our teaching and our next steps in the curriculum. The assessment for learning that we chose to use was a mastery approach to teaching. And this allowed us to concentrate on the students most in need, because we carefully sequenced the learning so that students who needed more support were not held back, but we looked at the same outcome in different ways. So students who needed the most support were given more support from the teacher. Students who needed challenge were set independent tasks, but the outcome remained the same. So we tried to simplify our outcomes in such a way that students did not move on to the next bit of knowledge. They got to practice with the knowledge that they already had. And this approach allowed assessment to be assessment as learning, because students were self-checking when they got to this process. The feedback that we presented to students was presented in such a way that it gave them control over their learning journey. So consider how you use assessment. Assessment of learning has always got the opportunity to be assessment for learning. And if we involve students in the process, it can also be assessment as learning. Looking a bit more closely at the curriculum for Year 7 in English, that first unit of work, following on from their reading unit, so it's the second unit, but the first unit was really to ensure that they knew how they were expected to work when reading in English. It also gave us an opportunity to assess their current positions, the first 2 weeks of term. Their first English unit, analysis, we looked very carefully at everything that was required for them to be able to write an analytical essay. So they needed to know what analysis was. They needed to know how they can work out writer's intentions through analysis, to understand how to predict how a reader may respond, to know what is meant by the context of writing, to know how to use their understanding of context to analyze a text, to be able to plan the analysis, to use quotations effectively, plan, introduce, conclude, and write the analysis. So we looked at the end point, what was expected, And then we thought, well, what are the teaching points that they absolutely need to know in order to reach that end goal? And so these would then become their flows. We called it a flow rather than a lesson, because it may have taken place over more than one lesson. To know and understand what analysis is quick, and there's a lot of specific knowledge that we can teach them. That knowledge is then come back to time and time again, but this is one lesson. To work out a writer's intentions, that depends on the class, on how quickly they can grasp this way of working. This is a substantive knowledge is included in this, but really this is a disciplinary way of working. So we highlighted exactly what it was that students needed to know, and then we planned our sessions around that. And this is what the flow may have looked like. The teacher will teach. As they're teaching, they know what assessment for learning they can use within the classroom to work out if students need more information or if they're getting it. So they may use questioning effectively. They may use exit tickets at the end of a session to gather information. They may quiz students at partway through the session, at the beginning, at the end. They may use closed tasks where students need to fill in the blanks. They may use traffic lights to get the students to show that they understand or don't understand or need more support. But assessment for learning is always used throughout the teaching. So imagine I'm teaching them what analysis is, and if, you know, I'm showing them exactly what it is. I might show them an example. I might get them to do a little bit of it so that, you know, they really understand it. But I understand at this point, students haven't got it yet. Now, through the assessment for learning, there may be a point where I think, okay, I think students have got this. And so we then check, have students got this? This may be recall questions if I'm checking at the beginning of a session. And the reason I wouldn't use recall of what I've taught within a session is it's too fresh in the mind. So it would be at the beginning of the session. But they are set a task which shows me they've either got it or they haven't. They may even be able to self-check whether they've got it or they haven't. But students are then involved in that journey if they're able to self-check. So assessment as learning, assessment for learning, because I am checking, are they ready to move on? Now imagine half of the students are ready to move on. The other half of the students have not got it yet. This is where I'm able to focus in on the students that have not got it yet. The students who've got it move on to a prove task. Can you prove that you know what analysis is? And so that task is designed for them to be able to do that independently. They're still achieving the same outcome as the students who have not got it yet, but they're proving their knowledge at this point. Assessment as learning. I know that because I can do this. But I am working with the students who haven't got it yet, and I'm adapting the knowledge so that they can understand. Then I might check with them, have they got it yet? Some students might move on. They've got it. They move on to proving their understanding. The students who've proved their understanding get to practice. So using their knowledge of analysis, they have a go at analytical tasks. The outcome for everybody is the same. The way that the students are working in the classroom may be different. It's always my aim to get students out of the teaching and into at least being able to check that they've got it. Brilliant if students can move out of the teaching, check, prove, and practice. But this is the way of working that allowed me to develop them in being empowered in their own place in the learning. So they're able to self-check, they're able to manage where they are in the learning, they're able to say why they know what they know. But it's also allowing me to work with the most in need of that extra information. And in order to do this, we needed to plan really carefully, what do students need to know? So that each of these I know statements, each of these have got activities or flow that allows them to move through the stages. Now, this isn't necessarily something that you have to do. It's an example of how we can be really careful with how we're using assessment for learning in the classroom. Pause the recording and consider this example against your own practices. How might you adapt what you do to allow students to be involved in their own learning, to allow you to work with students who need extra support without moving them on too quickly? Consider the assessment protocols that you use in the classroom every day. Do you have a specific set of protocols that you use as a department to ensure that assessment for learning is really effective? Now, if we use feedback effectively, it's a very low cost to use feedback effectively. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that if we get feedback correct, it can make a big difference to our students' learning. It has one of the highest impacts of all of the activities that we could do to improve learning in the classroom. So feedback is really important. Think about the common misconceptions that you expect to see time and time again on students' assessments. For your subject, what are the things that come up all of the time that you almost expect to see before you mark the work? You could think about this in terms of different year groups, your final examinations in a GCSE or A-level, but pause the recording now and consider what are the mistakes or misconceptions that happen every single time you do an assessment. If you've got your list of common misconceptions now, you know that you could prepare to make sure that those misconceptions don't happen, depending on how you sequence your teaching. So think carefully about how you sequence your teaching, but also consider how you might find out more about the students' misconceptions before they happen. A brilliant protocol to use as part of your assessment for learning practice may be the whole class feedback. So this idea comes from Mr. Thornton Teach and was originally a history example. But on here, we've got an assessment for learning mark and crib sheet. How this works, and it's great for saving time, is instead of writing the same misconception, the same comment on students' work time and time again, what you could do is you could just read the books and record the information for yourself. So you might want to record praise, any students who you could use as an example of good practice. So somebody that's done the task, done it really well, and you could take a photograph of that, display it on the board, use it under the visualizer, record that information. It may be also that the person that you're recording there requires extra challenge in the classroom. If anything is missing or incomplete, we record that too because it needs to be investigated. And if somebody was not in class, you may need to provide them with information, so that information is recorded. Any students who are a cause for concern, who may need extra support, we'll write those down. And then this box, the most powerful box for me, is misconceptions. And the reason it's the most powerful is because that's where you're recording your next steps for teaching. You know that a class, when you read their books, the same misconceptions, the same mistakes happen time and time again. So rather than repeating yourself and writing the same mistakes in every single book, you're recording them here. It may be that one specific student stands out as making a mistake nobody else has, but that will go down in cause for concern. If you've planned your sequencing correctly, then you'll know what the next outcome is for all of your students. You'll know what you're aiming for. And the misconceptions will need to be taught in order for them to reach that. So as you're reading through the books and writing this down, your next lesson is being planned. You know what gaps you need to fill. You know the outcome that everybody is attempting to achieve, and you know which students need support, which students need to catch up, which students may need challenge, and you're preparing that as you're marking. Marking is planning, but only if it's purposeful. If you're using what you find out there in order to give the whole class really specific feedback, specific next steps. What we don't want is to be repeating the same feedback all of the time. So we need to think about what we're going to do with the information that we take in so that students understand what they need to do next. And we are teaching exactly what needs to be taught in order to push students to the next step, or to get them to understand what we want them to understand, to get them to retain the knowledge. We need to know the gaps. So we can give them whole class feedback much quicker than we can write in their work, but it's got to be purposeful. When considering your endpoints, your assessment of learning, there's some interesting research around this. Before the national curriculum tests in England were introduced, there was no correlation between low self-esteem and low achievement in school. It was only after the national curriculum tests were introduced that this connection began to be made. So consider carefully how you give feedback to students, especially those students who we know are not achieving at the level we would hope them to achieve at their age range. Consider how you give that feedback in the most effective way to move learning forward, rather than to develop an image of themselves as somebody who is not achieving in school. Practice tests reinforce low self-image if the feedback that we are giving them is not effective in building their knowledge of what to do next. We know that students dislike a high stakes test. Even our best students, this can create anxiety. So consider the purpose of these tests. We know that at the end of their time with us, they need to be confident to sit real exams. So it is worth giving them the practice of that. But think about how we are giving them the information from those tests. Think about how the students are developing in their confidence, no matter what their starting point is. And also be really careful, because high stakes tests can become the rationale for all that's done in classrooms. We don't want to teach to the exam, and especially not in Key Stage 3. We want students to enjoy the learning process. We want them to learn how to learn. We want them to be really positive that education is an important thing that can lead them to better quality lives, can lead them into jobs that they want. But more than that, education is developing as humans and being able to make better connection as humans through the knowledge that we have. So don't make assessments endpoints the be all and end all of your classroom. Assessment for learning is so much more important, because it's the opportunity to feed back every single day to students, to feed into our teaching, to make sure it's at the right point that it needs to be. So consider how you are using evidence of achievement to adapt what happens in the classroom to meet the learner's needs. Often in the classroom, you will have the same mistakes being made by all students because they're at a similar level. You will have some students who need more input, and you will have some students who need more challenge. Consider how you assess their learning every day in quick and easy ways in the classroom. To be able to do that effectively, you need to know where the learner is going. So it needs to be a really clear learning outcome. They need to know what they're learning, why they're learning it, where it fits into the bigger picture. And if you've got a really clear image of that, like in my analysis example earlier, where there are clear learning steps, if you learn all of this, then you achieve this, it makes assessing the learning in the moment a lot easier. You need to know where the learner is, and this can change daily depending on the topic, but think about how you engineer the tasks in the classroom to give you an understanding of where the students are. Think about how you can then get students there, how it might be different for different learners. The aim is to get everybody to an excellent endpoint, but we may need to scaffold for some, we may need to challenge for others. Be careful that we're not scaffolding just because it's the way that things are done. Think about how you can make learners as independent as possible. We really want to activate students as owners of their own learning. So if we've got really clear outcomes, the students can see where it is that they are going and they can assess themselves. But really think about how we might activate that. Consider how whole class feedback might become a protocol for learning within your classrooms, but also consider how you will ensure that it's really effective. It is time saving and reduces workload, but if it becomes something that is just done because it's what we do in the department, rather than it being something that really drives your teaching, then it is going to be less effective. So when you consider the protocols that you want to use within the classroom to make assessment for learning really effective, consider how everybody will use this to have the best outcomes for students. Because we want students to retain the knowledge that we're giving them, retrieval practice has become something that happens in most classrooms. Whether we call it a remember me task, a do now task, it's often the teachers performing retrieval. You will have seen the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve before, and the idea behind retrieval is that we forget information over time. So if we can revisit information at systematic points, then it will be something that is embedded in our long-term memory. If we're thinking about our sequencing, that means that we will revisit the key information that we want students to learn in 1 year's time. They will still have that knowledge to remember it. If we simply create tasks that have questions on them that retrieve knowledge because it's something that they did last week, but it's not something that we've really systematically thought about, this might be less effective. We really want to identify the knowledge that students have. Now, the forgetting curve was developed by Ebbinghaus. You might be interested to know that this research was conducted. Imagine how many people was involved, a piece of research like this. You would imagine a few people, right? It was actually one person. Ebbinghaus himself was involved in the development of this research, and he tested himself on nonsense words. However, we do know there's something in that. But how we use retrieval practice is really important. There is some evidence to suggest that in some subjects, it is actually having a negative effect on the outcomes for students when it's being practiced. Now, if I reflect on that in terms of English, if I am spending 10 minutes each lesson recalling key quotations or recalling facts, then that's taken away from time on the disciplinary side of English, which is really, really important for students to be able to develop their writing skill and their reading at length skill, and their stamina for these things. So consider the effect that retrieval may have on your subject. And again, make sure it's being used for purpose. I want to show you two examples, and I want you to consider the effectiveness of each. So imagine that last week in English, students learned what a soliloquy was. They learned key quotations from Lady Macbeth's soliloquy. They learned key quotations from Macbeth's soliloquy, and they also learned what the word dialogue means. So they've learned this last week, and I set for them as an opening activity this retrieval task. Now, I want you to consider both tasks, and I want you to consider which one you think is the best and why. So in task A, students have to recall and write the character and the definition in the space provided. And in task B, students have to match the characters to the definitions and keywords. So I want you to pause the recording and consider these two examples and which ones you think are best and why. Okay, now you've had the chance to discuss them. I want to tell you a little bit more about this. So in example A, which a lot of people don't like because it's a difficult task, they are actually using the skill of recall. It's the skill of recall that they have to use when they get to an exam. This is difficult. It feels uncomfortable. They have to pull information from their mind rather than read the information. So if you opted for A, if you are doing a recall task, a retrieval activity, A is the most effective as that kind of activity. B is actually a recognize activity. They will see the words and they'll see the examples and they'll recognize them and be able to match them up. So therefore, they're not using the skill of recall that they would have to do in an exam because they wouldn't be provided with this in an exam. So consider exactly what it is that you are putting together for a recall activity and what the purpose is. If I want students in the early stages to be able to recognize these things, then that is excellent to use task B. However, I want to lead towards them being able to do a task such as A. So you'll see this example from science. Students have to recall keywords and write them in the spaces provided, or students have to match the keyword to the definition. B is a recognize activity. A is a recall activity. To involve students in their learning, you can have these conversations with students about the differences between how they might feel in activities like this. So in every subject, they will be recognizing things or they will be recalling key information. But have this conversation with students. The idea behind example A isn't that they will get all of the answers right. The idea behind A is that they feel the discomfort of recalling information. And so they learn that that is a natural thing to happen. Anything that they get wrong, that information is then used for their revision. Anything that they get wrong, they should be able to recognize that's what they got wrong and it's information that they need to revisit. That's assessment as learning, involving them in the process. You might even have protocols in the classroom where key information is recorded systematically by students. They've learned a new word and they create their own flashcard and they keep their flashcards for regular review activities. So imagine the end of a lesson, 3 weeks into term, students have been building up their flashcards. And at the end of that lesson, you say, okay, we're going to do our recall activity. Students test themselves. Now, how I do this is if I'm testing myself, I will put cards that I get absolutely wrong in one pile. I will get cards that I sort of almost knew in another, and cards that I absolutely knew in another. Then I mark the cards to say which pile they were in. The next time I do this recall activity, I should have revisited the information in that I absolutely didn't know it pile more often than the information that I revisited in the I knew it pile. Over time, the idea is that you get all of those cards right. So this is a nice system to use to get students, again, involved in their own learning, but share with them, how normal and natural it is as humans when we can't quite grasp something. We know we should know the right answer, but we can't get there. And we're developing those habits of learning here. It's this idea of being disciplined and being able to manage themselves, being able to reflect critically on their own position as a learner, and to be persistent in being able to get themselves to where they need to go, getting them involved in their learning. In order to assess where students are, it is really important for us as teachers to know where they should be. I want you to pause the recording and have this conversation as a department. Do you all know what a student's work who is on target in each of the year groups? Do you know what that should look like? So maybe you need to consider a specific topic or a way of answering a question in order to think about this. So if this was me, I would be considering what a student's piece of writing would look like in year 7, in year 8, and in year 9. So can you articulate the difference between year groups and what a piece of work should look like? Pause the recording and give that a go. In order to really understand what students' work should look like, we really need to think about how we moderate our students' work. We often moderate exam marking, but we should be moderating in every single year group. It's not just about consistency, it's about systematically planning in moderation that helps all teachers understand what a student's work should look like at each level of learning. It can also help you to adapt the curriculum if you can recognise that students perhaps could do more than you thought they were capable of. Or perhaps, it needs to be adapted because the targets that you are setting are actually too ambitious and perhaps students are not able to do that. But you should be able to use moderation really effectively in all year groups so that you can say, this is what a student's work looks like if they're working brilliantly in year 7, in year 8, in year 9. It'll really help you to be able to assess students too. Assessment has the opportunity to develop the learning habit of being collaborative. If we can really get a learning community who have a vocabulary around assessment for learning, they're able to assess their own work, assess peers' work, and have discussions as a class about how we improve, how we can feedback to move forward. So giving and receiving feedback is a collaborative activity if we set the scene correctly in our classrooms. Assessment as learning is a really powerful feed forward strategy of feedback if students know how to do it properly. Now, we've already said that feedback has a really high impact on students' learning, as does metacognition and self-regulation. A really high impact for a really low cost based on extensive evidence. Students understanding their own thinking processes and being able to regulate themselves. You can use protocols in the classroom to help involve students in their learning. I'll give you my example. I tell students at the start of term when I'm setting out this protocol that I want to be an artist. And then I show them my picture of these fish and I say, do you like my fish? And I'll get two responses from students. I'll either get, they're really good, well done, or I'll get, they're rubbish, miss. And both of those responses are not helpful. And this is a starting point for a discussion about what helpful feedback can actually be. So first of all, I say, if you tell me that these fish are good, then I'll keep drawing rubbish fish. Remember, I want to be an artist, so I need to get better. So although it's kind, it's not helpful, and it doesn't help me get better. If you tell me they're rubbish, I'll never draw fish again. And so that's not helpful either. Now I explain to students what could be kind, specific and helpful feedback. And we work together to develop the best feedback for these fish. Examples are, Miss, what if you get a picture of a fish online, print it out, and then use that to trace the outline? Then you'll have a more realistic picture of a fish. That's kind, it's specific, and it's really helpful because I've got something I can now do. Specific is the word that we really need to drill down on. That's the one that they don't tend to understand as quickly. So we develop lots of examples, and then I pull out my next picture of a fish. And we continue to work through that. I've actually got 3 examples that I show them of the work getting continually better until I pull out this example and I ask students, am I finished? And students say no. And I'm devastated because I drew this when I was 17 years old and now created this whole thing around it because I was really proud of my fish. But actually what students understand by the end of the process is that when we speak about work, in order to feed forward, we need to be kind, we need to be specific, and we need to be helpful. So therefore, when I give any advice, any feedback in class, I use that as a protocol. When students talk to each other about their own work, they use that as a protocol. Peer feedback, self-feedback, it's all kind, specific, and helpful. I keep these pictures of the fish in somewhere where students can see them. It's always a reminder of how we work together. It becomes a collaborative community in the classroom. How this might build up over time is that critique could be introduced in Year 7, a common learning language, and it's modelled by me explicitly. By Year 8, students are given weekly opportunities to critique example work, so they're really taking control of that. By Year 9, they are able to regularly critique and peer critique their own and others' work, but modelling and scaffold may still be in place. My aim is that by Year 10, they're systematically using the language of critique and not needing scaffolding anymore. So they're building year on year in their collaborative ways of working. In Year 11, they should be able to independently critique, improve through revision. They're able to assess. Critique should be a common learning language in Year 12, and this absolutely gets them university ready. So when I'm introducing something like this in the classroom as an assessment protocol, I'm not just thinking about it helping it then. I'm thinking, how does that develop them towards a successful future too? So consider what your assessment protocols are in the classroom and how they really push learners to do better. Not only is this way of working collaborative, it's also a disciplined way of working. So it's deliberate practice. It's students deliberately approaching their work and critiquing it to improve. Okay, let's look again at our own curriculum. Choose a topic that you are going to be teaching soon from your curriculum map. Use that topic in order to investigate your use of assessment. You might want to do this in pairs and look at different topics or even the same topic and then share ideas. Decide what the clear outcome is for that topic. Be really clear on that. It may already be clear. Then try to map the smaller learning goals that students need to master to reach that end goal. Finally, look at how you might test students' knowledge at each stage to ensure that they're ready to move on. How might you do that in everyday teaching in the classroom through assessment for learning? How might you do that in a way that empowers them, assessment as learning? How might you do that as a really effective endpoint examination that feeds forward into their next piece of work? So pause the recording and let's consider this in terms of a topic that you are about to teach. Okay, let's review in order to reflect upon where we are with our assessment for learning in the classroom and in the curriculum. So how well do your assessments inform teachers and students right now? How is assessment information used to improve learning outcomes? How well is assessment embedded in everyday teaching? How is everyday assessment used to improve learning outcomes? Is assessment systematically planned into the bigger picture? Pause the recording and consider the answers to these questions. Based on the previous activity, it's time to rate your current assessment practice. Again, thinking really realistically, because if we're realistic about where we are, then we know what we need to do next. Just like when we're assessing students, the more we are clear on where exactly we are, the better we are able to move to the next step and make things even better. Now what? There's always something that we can do to improve. So perhaps you need to carefully review your current practice, what's not working, what is working, what can make that better. Consider what improvements assessment practice would have on the outcomes of students. Consider what improvements to assessment practice would have the biggest impact on student outcomes. You might want to carefully sequence your assessments, trial ideas for improving assessment practice that will not overload teachers and will be much more useful to students. If your assessment is already brilliant, you could be trialing innovative assessment practices. That idea that we had from Mr. Thornton Teach is the kind of thing that we need in the classroom. So maybe you've got ideas of your own that could enhance learning over time, motivate students and teachers to progress. You've reached the end of the 3 videos to help you review your current curriculum. And hopefully by this point, you should be able to apply the explorations from all 3 sessions to make purposeful improvements to your own curriculum. Think about what you want to achieve. What's the impact of that on your students? Anything that you do should have a positive impact on student outcomes, should not overload teachers, and should feel like an exciting journey forward to make your curriculum better. Decide who is going to do what. Make really clear plans and make those plans achievable. Conversations about curriculum are great, but we need to make plans to get started right away to make these differences so that our curriculum is going to grow. Think about what can be achieved and get prepared to get started and take some action. Thank you for listening, everybody.